Hi, everyone. Welcome to journey number 24. Today we have Ashoka Rajendra on, and me and Ashoka had a great conversation about a week ago, and we ended up talking for over an hour here. And so I just want to kind of jump right into it because I think we could talk for a long time. But if you want to start us off here of just kind of introducing yourself, a little bit of context on who you are, what you're currently doing, where you grew up, everything like that.
Yeah. I'll give you my brief life history, condensed as I may make it. So I was born in Washington D.C. My family's from India, and I grew up in the D.C. metro area. I went to middle school, elementary school, high school here, and then went to college at University of Virginia. My kind of journey has taken me from originally, my plan in life was to be a doctor, and then that turned into a scientist and maybe physician scientist, and then now I work in the tech industry on biotech software for scientists. So giving the tools for them to design new treatments for disease, run diagnostics, create new kinds of plants and food. But there's a lot of zigging and zagging in between there. So I'm based in the Bay Area, I live in San Francisco, currently hanging out on the East Coast with my family, actually, in the DC area.
Amazing. And one of the most interesting things that we talked about, we talked a lot about, call your early life, kind of that childhood growing up in school. And because your dad was a doctor, correct? And so
Mhm.
you actually ended up doing a lot of work before you were even out of high school. Can you kind of take us through that and what kind of work you were doing, where that started? Because you were actually traveling, was it to Georgetown?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So as a kid, so my dad is an oncology and hematology doctor, which means he treats people with cancer or a variety of blood disorders. And my mom, for most of her career, kind of started and ran his medical practice. And when we were younger, after school, there weren't, we weren't really said to, daycare or camp or something like that. We just kind of sit around, the office and hang out with them. And a lot of my early childhood was spent going on rounds with my dad, and going and seeing his patients and how they were doing in the hospital and hanging around mainly cancer patients a lot of the time. And my parents, it's not the stereotypical Indian parents who are like, you have to be a doctor, you have to be, follow this path in life. They were really great about exposing us to pretty much everything at a young age and kind of let us kind of figure out what we wanted to do. But one of the things that really my mind was really stuck on, I was really stuck on this idea of how do you really help people reach their potential in life. And as I saw the treatments that my dad's patients were receiving, they seemed pretty brutal. And I hope in hindsight we'll think of them as barbaric, where the treatment they were getting is almost like a low dose poison where it hopefully kills the cancer and doesn't kill the person in the process. And a lot of what my dad was doing when he's seeing patients in the hospital and going on rounds was just mitigating the effects of the medicine that was supposed to cure them of the disease. So it's like, okay, you have this cancer, we're going to give you this medicine that kills cells that grow really fast. Well, that's why people's hair falls out. That's why their digestive system just gets knocked out from chemotherapies and things like that. And I really looked at that. I was like, there has to be a better way to do this, or must be a better way to do this. And very naively at a young age, I was very kind of obsessed with the idea of maybe there's a better way to treat cancer. And I'll prove my my what I said to my dad was, I want your job to not need to exist, by the time, I become a doctor, which again was pretty naive at the time, but that ultimately led me to my mom had handed me a bunch of magazines. She's like, hey, I think there's some interesting stuff in here, and started reading it. And I read about an enzyme that made cancer cells divide indefinitely. That's kind of the definition of cancer. So being the naive person that I was, I started reading more about it and I started emailing people, and I ultimately found my way into a lab at Georgetown where I could work on how could you take that insight of how cancer cells divide indefinitely and perhaps make it a way to treat cancer, or at least a way to make cancer more sensitive to uh, uh, these treatments with enormous side effects. So that's where that started.
And
But yeah, I was 15 at the time, and kind of 16 when I started getting into the lab and doing a lot of work.
I was just about to jump in and ask like how old you actually were there. you know,
Yeah.
yeah, it's always interesting too of, looking back on our childhoods and the different things that we were into. And like, for me, I remember at a very young age reading history books about like the ancient Romans and, the Greeks. And I was just like a big war buff and war nerd. And so I loved, learning about, the different equipment that they carried and their strategies and all that different things. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, I imagine a lot of it came from, you being in that environment so much, but, even hearing the fact that your mom handed you a bunch of magazines that were talking about, it must have been oncology and, you're reading about this enzyme. I think the big thing that I'm curious about is, especially as children, like at those younger ages, you're told a lot of times of, oh, it's nice to have dreams, but they're not realistic. Right. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think allowed you to actually make the jump of not just like, oh, I read about this enzyme and I think it could help, with these, cancer patients, to actually taking the step of doing the research, going to a lab and actually testing it out yourself instead of just thinking about it or being told that it's, you're so young, it's childish to think that you could have any sort of impact?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it goes that kind of realm of possibility or not being limited, I think really comes from my grandparents and then my parents. So my grandfather on my mom's side was orphaned when he was quite young, and he grew up in a very different time than we did. The British still ruled India. He was orphaned. He had malaria when he was in high school. He's living on his own. He's harassing the British military after school. Totally different world and experience, and completely incomparable to any trial and tribulation that I've ever gone to. But he managed through focusing on education to make his way to the U.S., get a PhD, have a successful career for himself, and then kind of put that learning and knowledge experience onto his kids, my mom, and then my dad. Similarly, made his way from India to the U.S. as a result of education. At the time, the only people allowed into the U.S. from countries like India had to be highly educated. So you really had to come up through that rat race of millions and millions of people just to make it to the United States. But from their experiences and really hearing about how they grew up and how they came here and how they got here, to me, I always felt that I had to make the most of opportunities that I had in front of me. And I felt this huge responsibility, not in a burdensome way, but really, I have every opportunity at my disposal, and I should use that. So when kind of coming into an idea or something I think is interesting to work on, there was never a point in time where I was discouraged from doing so, and usually the opposite. It's why don't you talk to that person? Hey, is this interesting? Hey, who can I talk to learn more about this thing? No matter what it was. You talked about the interest in the military. Ironically, that was something that didn't come from my parents at all, but I was obsessed. I read every book that you could think of, played every game, and I would go to my neighbors who all worked for the U.S. military or the government, and they're like, they come to my parents like, where is this interest coming from? Did you give him some war book? They're like, nope, that's all from him.
Yeah.
And we're not discouraging it. He's really curious, how this plane is a stealth fighter and how this thing, the memorized every plane in the book and every kind of tank in the book and every troop formation. So it was really this encouragement to follow curiosity wherever it leads, and also in some ways naive assumption that I can do that thing even if I don't know how to do it yet. And if I don't know how to do it yet, then people will help me get there. I also benefited tremendously from people who perhaps overlooked my naivety, but encouraged me as well. They probably saw me in a meeting. I remember I was talking to a medical director at a pharmaceutical company at my current job. That would be a great meeting to get. And I'm 17 years old and I'm talking about all these crazy ideas that I just read. And I really didn't know anything about anything. And he very kind of gently walked me through, if this idea was possible, this would probably be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but this seems interesting, or maybe you should poke in on that, or maybe you should look at this other thing. And instead of just flat out rejecting my lack of knowledge, it kind of guided me towards different paths that I could take down. So I benefit tremendously from my parents kind of giving me that set of opportunities and kind of seeing their experiences, feeling that responsibility to to do something with what, you know, what the opportunities have been given. And a lot of people who just look past my naivety, and instead of discouraging me or rejecting me, they just sent me off in different directions.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting too. And you know, I kind of want to poke at, you know, the fact that especially in your family, like not only, you know, most immigrants seeing, you know, education as, you know, the way out or the way up, whatever it might be, but specifically even in your family, like your grandfather, you know, education was, you know, his ticket, and then your father, it was his ticket. Have you thought about at all, like just the reason that your parents didn't force you into like you have to be a doctor? Because I think that that's very unique, right? I think that you know, a lot of times it's what worked for my dad, it's what worked for me, it's what's going to work for my son, and that like very almost not strict but more rigid idea of seeing the world. But it sounds like your parents were very encouraging of just like, hey, go explore, go find what you like. There's not like that specific path that you have to follow. Have you thought about it all, where that comes from within them? Like, is that just their natural state of being, or yeah, have you given any thought of that, thought to that?
Yeah, I think that there is a big portion of how immigrants look to de-risking things, because the path that they went down really constrained how many mistakes that they could make. You know, if you think about my grandfather, you know, being an orphan, he had no choice but to excel in school. And if you think about, you know, coming up in the United States and as immigrants, in some cases you don't have such a wide latitude of opportunities available to you. You have to excel, you have to be the best at school, you have to be 10 times better than everybody else just to get to the same place. You know, my dad talked about being put at some of the worst hospitals in New York City, seeing the craziest cases. And there were a number of situations where the attending physician or the chief resident didn't really know what he was supposed to do in that situation, closes the curtain, tells my dad, hey, here's the patient, here's what, you know, what the situation is. My dad knew what to do. He wouldn't give him any credit for it, but he kind of was constantly in these situations where he had to not just be as good as everyone, but, you know, 10 times better, and work just, you know, that much harder just to be in the same place. So I think a lot of it just came from, you know, we brought you here to this country in order to explore all the possibilities that, you know, that this place has to offer, so that you don't need to just follow a single path. Now, where there, you know, errs towards like, hey, maybe you should go to grad program, or maybe you should, you know, do this or that. But it came from we want to set you up so that any dream that you pursue is something that is possible. Is that, you know, going to college, let's not worry about the money part of that. Is that, you know, postgraduate, don't let that be a factor. We'll figure it out. Is it, you know, you want to start a company? Go, great, go do that. And, you know, there is some kind of fallback. So it was really a shift from do this thing because it will reduce risk, to pursue these different things that you want to try. And you will have this kind of baseline to fall back on, so that you can kind of really go out in the world and try things that might not work out, which is definitely a mindset shift. Because, you know, honestly, a lot of the people in the generation above me and above that didn't, you know, failure is not something that was really an option, right? And
Yeah.
you get kicked out of the country, you get a visa, but, you know, just even allowing for that experimentation and exploration just opens up a whole different world. And yeah, I don't, you know, I think without, you know, my parents kind of providing that mindset and kind of opportunity, you know, I probably wouldn't have gotten very far, as far as I have.
No, that's super cool and so important. And, you know, like as I've started looking at my own life and looking at other people's lives, and just realizing how much your parents affect you both positively and negatively, whether you realize it or not. And so I'm always interested to, you know, hear more about those dynamics and, you know, what the experiences were like for different people. But, you know, I think another really interesting piece to this conversation, we talked a lot about it in our last, when we chatted, was almost this naivete of, you know, getting into
Mm-hmm.
these meetings. And, you know, as such, you know, like legitimately a kid at this point, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like you said, you know, getting a meeting with a medical director, that would be a good meeting for you now in your career. And you also said that, you know, you talked to some Congress people and, you know, some other high ranking people. First of all, what do you think it was that got you in the room? And, you know, how much do you like, I think that there's a very fine balance and walking the line of naivety of, feeling like you belong there, or not even realizing the gravity of the meeting that you're in, but still, taking it seriously, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
And can you kind of walk us through that, of just how you got in those rooms, and then once you're in those rooms, what you learned from it, and how we can take some of those lessons and apply them later on in our lives as well?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's a great one. I'm trying to unpack. So one is how to get in the rooms in the first place, why, and kind of that balance between naivete versus understanding kind of the gravity of the situation that I'm in. I think something that I've noticed throughout my career is people, particularly in high positions, maybe not the middle layers and below, are very open with their time and kind of attention. If you're not asking them for anything, you're just asking them because you're curious, you're interested. And something that I think I've just benefited from tremendously is if the premise behind your interest, or you're meeting them or you're talking to them, is purely driven by curiosity and desire to learn and just raw interest in what they're doing, they love taking those meetings. They love, I might have zero understanding of what they do, completely wrong assumptions, outdated facts and materials, but they just really get excited by the fact that I'm excited and I'm curious, and they're very encouraging of that. And I wasn't really asking them for anything. And I think the how to get those, I think uh, I didn't at the time have a sense of I'm bothering them, or I shouldn't send this email. I shouldn't go knock on their door at university. I shouldn't bother them, or walk up to them. I just didn't know any better. And interestingly, over the course of my career, I have my email, it's filled up. Oh, I don't have much time to talk, etc. But I kind of turn that on its head and say, pretty effective people often make the time, often respond in the email. And if you just want to talk to them for 30 minutes, they'll do it. And they don't think they're, any better or different than anybody else. And those tend to be leaders of companies, CEOs, politicians, et cetera. So I think the premise of curiosity and just desire to learn, along with not really at the time having any anxiety that I was bothering somebody, and just, somebody gave a talk that I liked, I'll just go up there and just ask them a question and say, hey, can I meet with you? Can I get your business card? Can I email you? And just bugging them repeatedly. And it's remarkable now how much anxiety I have. Oh, do I send this email intro? Do I bug this person? When on the other hand, now that I've sat in that same position, I'm like, it's just an email, right? It's just a thing on a screen. You're not bothering them at all. And ultimately, it's 30 minutes of their time in the grand scheme of things, which could disproportionately impact other person's life in a positive way. So I think, I had a period of maybe I'll just step off the gas on that, and oh, maybe I look dumb in that meeting. But I think if it's from a kind of motivation of curiosity, they'll give the time.
For sure. And, I think like a lot of times walking into those rooms, later on in your life, it's a lot of imposter syndrome too, right? Of just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, what do I have to offer this person? Right. Like, I don't belong in this room, whatever it might be. And, sometimes it's actually a blessing when you're younger. And, again, that naivety coming in of just like, well, I'm just curious. Like, I just want to, almost more wondering about the question than who they
Mm-hmm.
actually are, right? Of just like, he's so focused on what you're trying to figure out and what you're trying to learn, that it's just like, oh, this person might be able to give me the answer, instead of, putting so much pressure on it. And so it's a really interesting, idea of kind of approaching things that way.
Yeah, and generally, I've not been one to really respect or care too much about hierarchies. Ironically, the further I get in my career, I'm like, oh, do I speak up in this forum or this setting? But I think people appreciate just not putting a weight on the hierarchy versus the substance and the curiosity. And that's something that I almost have to go back to what I did as I'm like, why am I hesitating here? If I was 19 years old and in college, I just would have reached out to them and not even thought twice about it.
Yeah,
And I always got to kind of force myself, honestly, to revisit. I'm like, I'm more qualified to have this meeting than I ever have been in my life. And yet I might have gotten the meeting when I was 19 years old. I got to kind of maybe get back to that a little bit, because,
for sure.
some of these Congress people I talk to, or CEOs of this or that, I'm like, I still have the same questions and curiosity. I shouldn't, be
Yeah,
so anxious about it.
for sure. And so you actually ended up like doing lab at Georgetown for, I think it was 4 years, correct? And actually, um, essentially creating an entire project out of it. And you actually ended up entering and winning a science. It's a national science fair. Is that what it was? Can you just tell a little bit about that story and how that unfolded?
Yeah, yeah. So as this project got underway, I really got obsessed with the depth of what I was working on. And that was one thing that was kind of the one of the first times where I found something I was working on where there was no end to what I could learn about it. So I was just reading papers day and night. I was looking in the lab, I was learning new techniques, and it was just so it was just the first thing that was really satisfying, this insatiable appetite to learn and work on things. And I worked on a project for Georgetown for about 2.5 years while I was in high school. And it was kind of this weird duality of I would wake up really early and go to Georgetown and go do my work and wake up at like 5 in the morning and then commute over there. And it was like smoking hot and I was like wearing nice clothes because I'm like, oh, this is a professor. So I need to wear nice clothes in their lab. And then I realized no one cares in the summer in DC. And I would stand in the walk-in refrigerator and like try and cool down. And then I would do all my work. And then I would go drive to football practice and go, be outside for another 6, 7 hours. And just grinding and grinding and grinding away. And then people suggested, you should enter this into a science competition. I was like, oh, I'm doing this because I think it's interesting. And naively at the time, I think I'm going to make some grand discovery no one else has noticed before. But I was encouraged, like, hey, but why don't you put this into a science competition? And I ended up winning or entering and then winning the county science fairs. One was sponsored by Intel, so the Intel Science and Engineering Fair, and then one was actually run by the U.S. military. So at the local level, I won both of those, which sent me to the national and international level, and that was this gateway open where I was able to compete and explain my work. But really more interestingly than that, I met the smartest people I'd ever met at that point in my life ever. And they're all my age and they were all interested and had this kind of ambition and drive and desire. And I had smart kids in my high school, but this was just the next level. It wasn't just kind of what they knew and what they had learned, or they had patents when they're 16 years old or something like that. They were really ambitious and creative and interesting. It was this wow moment. And in that situation, I ended up winning for medicine and health research. And that was also a moment of, despite the fact I didn't have necessarily the early start that these people all had, I realized that they were not that different from me. Most of them just maybe started when they were, and this is insane, typically 10, 11, and 12 years old. There were a few true, off the charts savants, kind of the Einstein level. They just kind of, they're just pure geniuses. But for the most part, they were curious, ambitious people who followed that curiosity and worked on things they found interesting. And maybe they just did it earlier than me, but I didn't. At that fundamental core, I did not see myself as that different or really any different than any of these people. And I ended up being the first person in my county's history to actually win the science competition in, I don't know, 70 some odd years the county's been incorporated. And that was kind of a big moment of kind of society values what I did. And there are people who are also interested in that same thing. And that was kind of ignited a spark that kind of set me off in the direction of more entrepreneurial activities.
Yeah, because that's the interesting thing too of, up to this point, you're working on this project that's, very medical based, very intense. And the idea being that you want to be a doctor. And then, at some point you actually kind of switch gears a little bit. And I forget, was that before applying to college or was that after you had applied to college? How did that kind of
It was after.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I entered college, I had my hair on fire about I want to do scientific discovery, and that's the way to be innovative. That's the way to affect and impact the world. And pretty much everyone around me was telling me that. Authority figures, are at my high school was sponsored by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. They had this beautiful research campus, and the message was basic fundamental scientific discoveries are the way to kind of create change and innovation in the world. So I was like, okay, got it. I went to Georgetown, got that same message. The science fair run by the military. America's falling behind. We need more people in science. I'm at the Intel Science Fair, same deal. They're like, we need you to stay in science and engineering. And everyone's going to Wall Street. And at the time, this is kind of like 2007, 8, 9, where financial crisis. And we're like, okay, well, maybe the PhD shouldn't be, messing around with the credit markets or something like that. But that was the message. This is the way that you do, that you can improve the world and innovate. And it wasn't until college that a couple holes got poked in it. And what I mean by that is, it's not that what they're saying was not important, but whether or not that was the right thing for me specifically as an individual to create the change I wanted to see in the world, to use a cliche, where I was obsessed with the idea that I have to be working in a lab and make a scientific discovery to improve people's lives. And the thought that there were other avenues out there didn't really kind of occur to me, because that wasn't the environment that I was exposed to. It was more about basic scientific discoveries. And when I went to college, I felt this dread. The first semester of school, I took the train up to Georgetown on Thursdays in the morning, kept doing my work, took it back in the evening, and while everyone is out, partying at school. And it wasn't really that so much as I felt like I was getting diminishing returns. And I looked around me and I wasn't sure if this was the ultimate path I wanted to go down, where basic science, people who do this are heroes, because you can be working on something for 3, 5, 10 years and it never pans out. And kind of the amount of effort you put in versus the outcome that you get is really off balance, at least in terms of what I wanted. But a few people kind of poked holes at what kind of this assumption that I had made that really set me off on a different path. So some of those people, where I approached with my naivety about what I wanted to do, told me that, I don't know if doing scientific discovery in a lab is actually what you are best suited for as an individual. It's not that it's not important for society, but I don't know if that's the right thing for you. And that really just, broke this constraint that I had put on myself and allowed me to explore other methods by which I could create and build things, which was still something I wanted to do for a positive purpose in the world and society, which led me to more entrepreneurial ventures and more towards computer science than strictly lab work. And that kind of set off a whole other adventure. But it really wasn't until I got around to the dread of, wait, I'm not doing something that everybody told me was important. And am I failing at this thing? And then people kind of bursting the bubble of, it's okay if this isn't actually the specific thing that you want to do. And maybe you should explore these other things and see if you like them better. And I got a lot of advice that in hindsight, I didn't listen to enough.
Yeah.
And realized, sometime later that's what they're trying to tell me.
Yeah. And, is that, how important, in your life now is that idea of finding people around you that are able to poke holes in what you're doing? Having those people that can kind of see through it and, identify your blind spots. And even if they aren't necessarily true, right? Like if maybe they poke at something and you go, you know what? No, I still believe this, or I still think I'm on the right path. It sounds like a lot of these people that did it this time around, it just happened, it was more happenstance of, they were around you, they saw you, they got to know you, and then they poked holes in it. Do you make any sort of conscious effort to try to find those people in your life now that can poke holes in your hypothesis, in what you're doing, or again, is it more by happenstance when that happens?
Yeah, I do actually. I have kind of looked back on my life retrospectively and found many instances where people were trying to give me advice that I think would have totally changed how I saw a situation or a given point in my life. And I have, probably unhealthily looked at, well, if I had different information, or if I had listened to this person, or if I did this, or what if, I go on and on and on that. And, I can't change any of those decisions in the past, but what I can do is, how do I improve the way that I actually make decisions in my own life? And my kind of preferred way of doing that is going out in the world. It could be people who have known me my whole life. It could be people who barely know me, but the common thread is they can help me look at things in a different way, kind of challenge those assumptions and really, figure out, okay, if I really am at some existential turning point, what's the right way to think about it? And is it this big deal that I'm really making it out to be? I think at many points in my career, I've had these crossroads where I have, in hindsight, imposed constraints on myself that were causing me a lot of anxiety and dread that just when looked at from a different perspective, totally melted away. And why did I do that? And having those people come in and tell you, you know what, it's, if you actually do this other thing, it's not the end of the world. Or actually, did you know that you don't actually have to do this thing at all? And it totally kind of resets your assumptions and how you look at things. So it could be anything from advisors, mentors, or professors in college saying things like, hey, if you want to stop for half a semester and just kind of figure out what you want to do and come back, you know that's not going to ruin your future, right? I've written letters of recommendations to students who have done this many, many times, and I think they're better off for it. Even that just poked the notion of every semester must be perfect. Otherwise, I'll never get into a graduate program or never get to do this or that. And just saying that was like, oh, wait a minute, I can do that. Or other people saying, you don't actually have to publish a paper to get this experience that you want out of it. You did the research. Why do you don't need a publication? You could start a new project. Killing your baby sucks, but you could just start a new thing. And the thing that you did may not have been the right, opportunity. Or somebody saying it's not a failure to realize that the personality type and disposition to be a scientist is not what you are. And actually you should probably do this other thing, like be an executive in a company that really deals with science. And really just poking at that, and you're like, why did I whip myself so much into this constrained world that it's causing so much dread? And then as soon as those new perspectives come in, it just melts everything away. And then I can make a decision that actually makes sense to me. So I highly recommend having, I hate calling it, it's not like your personal board of directors, but people who can really challenge your assumptions and make you think about things in a totally different way. You don't need to take their advice, but you need that thought exercise, because I've had so many moments in my life where I'm creating a situation of my own making and of my own kind of mental prison, when somebody can just step in and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think you're looking at this the right way at all.
For sure. And, it was a really interesting thing for me. I actually had to deconstruct a lot of my past. And it's a lot of times, we make assumptions and that this is the way things are. And especially when we make them at such a young age, or when they've been ingrained in you for a very long time, you then start assuming that they're truths and forgetting that they're assumptions. And every once in a while, you need somebody to come in and poke that bubble for you. And just, like as simple as, well, that's not the way it has to be, can, ultimately be life-changing, right? And, that's essentially what happened to you, where you were saying taking half a semester off, and you're that's where you really fell into computer sciences and kind of changed the trajectory of where you were going. And you told me stories about you essentially being part of the first hacker house at the University of Virginia. Can you kind of go into that and what that flip was like to do something different for the first time in since you were 15, really? And why you were kind of drawn to it, and was there a specific moment that it really flipped in your mind where you're like, oh, this is not what I'm supposed to do, this is a new this old path that I was on is not the one that I was meant to be on, I'm going to jump over to this new path? Or was it a gradual kind of process?
Yeah, I think the thing that I conflated for a very, very long time, after I had really gone deep down this path of biomedical research and I'd gotten into the Cancer Center Director's Lab at UVA and I presented, is I had conflated what I think people will think of me if I choose to stop doing this or choose a different path, and that kind of, what is my reputation? What will they think of me? And, have I failed them or let them down? They took a chance on me, and all of that kind of built up from what are the things that I want to do that actually give me the kind of rewarding, kind of insatiable, appetite fulfilling thing. And one of the big things was realizing that, and I think this was a fairly big mindset shift, one that not so much that my parents didn't teach me, but it was just kind of a newer thing for our generation, is that you can have a lot of different paths in life, and that you can try things that you don't have to do your whole life. They don't have to be your thing forever, and they can be temporary, and you can learn from them, and then you can take that into the next thing that you do. And just having that idea that is only, it gets crystallized again and again and again as I try different things, that you have to simultaneously hold in your head that most things that you will do will never pan out, but also uh, you should really give your best effort on things to get the most out of them is a really difficult idea to reconcile because you know at a minimum the default state is failure. And maybe like your peers might say, oh, if something didn't work out, then there's something wrong with you. And instead of thinking uh, somebody truly hasn't tried something if they were not in control of its success, meaning, in school, every test you can pass. There is a way, there is an outcome where somebody can succeed no matter what. But really trying things where no matter how hard you try in your best efforts, you could still not succeed. I think realizing how to think about those kinds of opportunities was an enormous shift, because instead of thinking of trying something, getting something out of it, but not doing it for my life or not getting the success I wanted, it was totally the wrong way of thinking about it. It was kind of like collect the accolades, pad the resume, instead of I should assume these won't work out, but that's not a bad thing. And I should try really hard. So that was kind of like realization number one was that I can try something new and I should expect to try more things, and they may not work out. I think another thing was, this sounds really obvious, but taking time off just gave me room to think. I really overextended myself with different classes I was taking and projects I was working on, and I didn't really have actual space to synthesize what I was thinking. I had dread and feelings, and just doing nothing for even a few weeks crystallizes a lot in your head, a lot of things that you're hearing and not processing, or a lot of insight, people advice, and so on. And fully bringing that together doesn't really happen unless you have the mental space to do that. And the other thing was really finding creative outlets that matched kind of my mental disposition. I don't know how else to describe it, but really working in a research lab where you could spend months setting up an experiment and a piece of dust ruined it. And you could spend years working on something and lots, billions of dollars, and it never pans out. It is not kind of my disposition. And I having a much tighter loop between idea and creation and getting feedback, talking to people, getting that out in the world, that was my disposition. And I also realized I conflated the work I did in the lab with going to science fairs and competing. I liked competing. I liked talking to people. I liked explaining to the world the research that I did and what I found. But a lot of the manual labor in the lab, I didn't quite like. So that around this time, there were these kind of bubbling ideas around, computer science. We should try that. And some friends were interested in it. And I ended up just stacking a semester full of computer science classes. And all of a sudden it opened this world of, I can do something, I can have an idea, I can type it into a keyboard, I create something, and somebody can use it and somebody likes it. I was like, holy shit. And that was this huge aha moment of, here is something that matches the creative outlet that I want, that can create the impact that I want. And then I, had my hair on fire, like, who else knows this thing? Unfortunately, most people in my school were not that interested in that, and were more interested in getting jobs at, corporate and whatnot. They're just like, okay, like, computer science isn't that cool. Like, why, like, we're going to McKinsey, we're going to JP Morgan. But I did find a set of people, and there's this alumni, Spencer. He went to school because he wanted to build stuff. I went to school because I wanted to build stuff. Both of us were sorely disappointed at what University of Virginia thought school was for. And he was, a few years out from us. So he convinced some alumni to rent a house that was on top of a bar. And he was like, I just need the house, some Wi-Fi, and some whiteboards. And I'm going to go find kids who are interested in just building stuff. And he found me, he found some other people. And I had this community of people who were just interested in building things. It could be apps, it could be companies, it could be code, it could be research, it could be anything. And that was the common thread. And that kind of really changed my trajectory, because I had a new outlet and a new path for, the kind of underlying motivation of creating things and getting them out in the world.
No, I love that. And I wanted to back up a little bit to what you were saying of this idea that most of the things that you're going to try, you're going to fail at, or, they're not actually going to work out. And just kind of taking that a layer deeper too, of that's almost the way that we're trained, right? Is that you have to succeed, you have to be successful at things. And that's why you don't switch, right? That's why you don't switch, is because, now you've gotten good at something. If you'd go and try something new, there's that possibility of failure. And, taking it that layer deeper, and something that you and I chatted about was this idea of, a polished exterior, and hiding away, the actual messy reality of what you're going through, or what it took to get to where you are, or to, achieve, or whatever it might be. And even going back to, those science competitions, and, meeting these genius people that, have been working on projects since they were 10 years old, and realizing that just because they have this external success doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't troubled, right? Or that they also don't have their own shit that they're going through, or that to actually get there was not their own choice. And so much pressure was put on them from the outside that they had to mold themselves into this person that shows up a certain way. And it actually leads to deep, unhappiness. And, what do you see the importance of showing people that it's okay to fail, showing people that it's okay to be messy? Or what is your own journey with some of that stuff of, everything on the outside looks great, and, people are telling you that you're doing amazing, but there's a disconnect. There's something that's not, internally, it's not the same. It's not how it's showing up externally.
Yeah. That's a great question. And I need to, unpack all the different pieces of it, because I think the importance of kind of podcasts like these, and what people like you're putting together, is that a lot of what people see is like the press release of someone's life, or the highlight reel of their life. And they have little to no kind of background as to how they got there. So people, we kind of have this hyper optimized, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, of seeing the highlight reel. And we have kind of are relatively underserved in seeing how they actually got there. And I think it creates a lot of comparisons and dread in people, that I haven't done this, or I haven't achieved this thing, I haven't done this thing, and can cause them to act in ways that might undermine their own ability to succeed in the way that they want to, because you're comparing yourself to people, where it's really, if you look at someone's life and you're like, oh, I wish I achieved this thing, you can't just trade places with them. You have to take everything, right? You can't just trade for this one thing. You have to take the good and the bad and everything they have. And I saw people who, through these competitions, maybe their parents really pressured them to do this. Maybe their parents said, hey, you're going to go work in a lab, you're going to go win this thing. And they just burned out. The first year of college that they had any level of freedom, they just fully burned out. They might have, dropped out of school for a period of time. They might have totally changed their life. They might have had mental health issues. So there were a lot of people where it was just this, I never actually wanted to do this, but I had to, and I get put into a high stakes situation where I'm competing with all these, crazy smart people. And success to me is what, like making a discovery as a kid. How is it possible that you could kind of whip yourself into that, or getting into certain schools, and seeing these people kind of fall from that stage where they didn't kind of meet the expectations that were artificially imposed onto them. And that was kind of one thing that I saw. I also saw other people who were quite brilliant, but had a lot of underlying troubles. They were the genius kind of inventor person. They go to a place like Harvard or MIT, and one of whom, who was a huge inspiration for me, ultimately took his own life. Sometime while I was in college, where everyone wanted to be around this guy who's so generous with his time. But I think there were other things going on that, again, you won't see from the outside in, you won't see in the news article, the press release, but hang around him enough and you're like, something's not quite right here. And I think it's incredibly important for people, when they're looking at stories of how people got there, to really dig in, 10 levels deeper, and understand, how did they get there? Don't compare yourself to the achievement. It's like, do you see something in common between your life and their life? If so, then poke into that and figure that out. And that's when I read books about people, or I hear someone that did something interesting, I go look at their LinkedIn. I'm like, what did they do in their career? And if it's all these kind of great successes one after the other, like, I probably don't have a lot in common with that person. But if they have this kind of more zigging and zagging path, like I want to meet that person. I'm really curious what their life has been up until this point. And I just think the content that we get is just so dominated by these highlight reels, and people really understand that. I think there's an unhealthy dynamic either of those people who have these successes where behind the scenes, maybe that's not what they asked for, what they wanted. They want to do something different and they're kind of constrained by this thing everyone wants them to do. But other people who unhealthy, myself included, will make unhealthy comparisons that send you off the path of what you actually truly as an individual want to do. And you end up being unhappy in a different way later when you realize, I did all that stuff that those people I was comparing myself to did. I don't think I'm any happier for that. I mean, I would see all these people in San Francisco traveling these exotic places and they seem happy. So I went and did that. I'm like, I like this, but I don't think it's really doing it for me.
Yeah.
And, I don't think it's really, solving my appetite for different things. I just looked at what other people were doing and emulated it, and it didn't really do it for me.
No, it makes so much sense. And, the other one that I think about a lot is, so when I've started kind of this journey of really just, I say, blowing up my life and starting over,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, I coined it my quarter life crisis. I thought I was so clever. And then as I talk to everybody, it's like, oh no, I've gone through that, or I'm going through that, or whatever it might be,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, as I started thinking about it more, it seems like, especially at such a young age, it is a very laid out path of these specific
Mm-hmm.
goals. And, like the college culture up here isn't the same, but we still have, the clout of like a Harvard or an MIT or a Stanford, whatever it might be. And, that idea of you're working your whole life to achieve something, right? Of, getting into Harvard, graduating from Harvard. And now you're still, depending, like, you're 22 to 25, and now you've graduated and you've worked your entire life towards that moment. And it's like, well, now what? Right. And
Mm-hmm.
you're not close to having your life over. You still have a lot in front of you. And going back into, well, how much of that was I actually wanted to do it, and how much of it was those external voices or those, people telling me this is what I should do, or this is, this is what success looks like, and when it might not actually resonate with you. And I think that's what hit me the hardest, was that no matter what level of professional success I reached, I was like, oh, like this will be, once I hit this, then I'll be happier. Like once I hit this, then I'll feel like, I'm important, or I've achieved enough. It was always the same feeling inside. It's like, oh, actually nothing has changed. And going, oh, I know what the problem is. I didn't shoot high enough. That's my problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you double
Mm-hmm.
your goal. But it's just, you never actually get there because you're not doing it for the right reasons. And, it sounds like very similar to kind of, what you've seen in other people.
Yep. Yep. I think to your point about blowing up your life and having that quarter life crisis, I highly encourage people to frequently, maybe it's every couple of years, maybe it's every 5 years, to really dramatically assess everything that they're doing. That doesn't mean that you should actually totally change course, but people spend remarkably little time questioning whether or not something is right for them, or something that's whether they want to continue doing it. And they will only do something about it when it reaches this crisis point. And oftentimes when they're much more constrained on their ability to change anything about it. And I remember this time my older brother brought me to, like at the time, I think I was like 20 years old again. And it was this like young professional meeting, and they're in their mid to late 20s. And it was, people were drinking wine in a room, introduce yourself. Oh, why'd you join this group? And it was like a young professional group, and it was kind of like entrepreneurial and so on. Every single one of them disliked what they did, and were trying to make these at age 25, 27, 29, 30 career pivots. And they're like, man, I really hate what I'm doing. I never wanted to do this. I'm taking night school. I want to do this. I want to do that. And I was like, oh my God. But then simultaneously, if you're then younger and you're 19 or 20 years old, those same people make you feel bad for trying a whole bunch of stuff. You're trying out these different things. Oh, that's risky. Why are you doing that? That doesn't seem lucrative. That doesn't seem like it'll be successful. Or you tried something that didn't work. those are the people who are interviewing at the jobs. If you have an unconventional background and telling you, oh, well, resume looks a little, ziggy and zaggy. And then, later in their lives, they, wake up one day and they're like, wait a minute, I don't even like what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And by the way, I spent my whole life judging people who are trying to figure that out themselves. And it's this weird kind of off balance thing where I think that that dread and anxiety around experimentation, particularly around earlier ages, can it can really send people away from what they actually wanted to do in the first place. And that can be in both ways. Maybe somebody succeeded at something, which is often what happens in particularly gifted people, and then they don't want to do it anymore. They actually are are not interested. It's like this guy I was telling you about. Maybe they were like a celebrity where they had an amazing voice and they really succeeded at that, but that isn't actually what they want to do. But everyone's telling them that they should. And vice versa. The people who do want to try different things, do want to experiment, are told by everyone around them that they shouldn't, and are in environments that are not encouraging of that. And then they lap those their peers later in their lives, but they have to suffer through a pretty long time of kind of wandering around in the desert to figure out what they want, only to find their peers years later saying, "Oh, I think you were kind of onto something. Can you give me some advice?" And then you're like, "Oh, okay."
Yeah. And, I think for me, it goes back a lot to how success is measured by people, right? Or like, oh, you're gifted in this and therefore you'll be successful at it. And so you have to do it, instead of looking at like, well, what if success was how happy you are doing what you're doing? What if it's, how fulfilled you are? And if that comes with making money, great. If it doesn't, great, right? But as long as you can survive and as long as you're fulfilled and happy, I think that's more of the conversation of what it should be around. Now, it's funny too. We've been talking a lot about it, but once you really started getting into entrepreneurship, a lot of times those voices are even louder, right? Of not only around the company of, oh, you shouldn't be doing that. Like, this is the market you should be going after. These are the features that you should be releasing, of those outside voices, but also those people. And a lot of times the people that are very close to you and care about you a lot, of like, well, why are you doing that? That's so high risk. Like, it's probably going to fail. There's so many voices and so much pressure. And a lot of times you don't necessarily have somebody to lean on in those situations, or it's, your group or your co-founders or whoever you're doing it with. How do you suggest that people are able to, listen to those voices to see if there's any validity to it? However, to block them out and not let it influence their decisions too much. How do you find that balance? How do you keep going when everyone around you is telling you that it's not right, it's going to fail, whatever it might be, but you see something or you feel it in your body, or just you enjoy doing it so much that you don't care and you need to see it through? How do you suggest that people block those out, and how have you done it in the past?
Yeah, I'll be honest, not very successfully, but I get better every time. I think the part of the voices that are useful and important to listen to are, the common thread, I think, has been people who have a good gauge on whether or not you as an individual are actually fulfilled and happy, and much less of a commentary on like the what of what you're actually doing. Because I think as a temperature check, whether that's your parents, your girlfriend, your close friends, that are people who really know you as an individual, you might have all kinds, this thing you're trying is risky, or that, or and you get a lot of feedback on that. When I was starting companies and we were getting funding, we had an office, and by other measures might be successful, and then I go to kind of college, post-college meetups with people I went to school with, and they're just kind of negging and down on everything, that I'm doing. But even when working at a startup that, ultimately became successful, it wasn't really the people, oh, you're doing that risky thing or whatever, that really kind of poked my bubble and made me listen, because I was like, we have millions of dollars investment, we have employees, we have prototype, like, it created some dread, but more in a social context. It's like, I don't feel comfortable around these people, don't really understand what I'm doing or what I'm about. But the one that really kind of made me listen was, we had this office in downtown DC, and kind of a great spot. And I was stopping by to see my friend's dad, who owned a bar and restaurant down the street. I was grabbing something for there. And I was like, yeah, I have an office over here. We have, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, told him what I was doing. It's like, what happened to all that cancer stuff you were doing? It's like, that was just, I remember, how you were just obsessed about that. And what happened? And that just cut me to the core. And I had this looming kind of dread. And, this is a friend, Patty, who had coached my basketball team when I was in fourth grade. Didn't know me that well, but he could just tell that it didn't add up. Like what I was doing, and even I could tell myself a story. Oh, this company's successful, and it has gone on to be very successful. But he kind of really poked through that and cut to the core, and that's the kind of voice I would listen to. Is somebody who they don't need to be the same person as you, they don't need to value the same things as you, but can they really take a good check on kind of your fulfillment, your happiness, and make you honestly assess that one way or the other, because that's the only time not the only time, but most of the time where that advice really is worth listening to, because that's the only thing that matters. I mean, to your point, you said, are you happy and fulfilled? But even though people are saying you're not, like, I think it's much easier for them to block out the voices if they have that fulfillment, and you kind of know it when you see it. Like it's really hard to block out the voices when you know something is wrong and off yourself, and then it's hard to figure out what voices to actually listen to. But when you in your bones just feel it, you know it when you see it, and you just can't stop thinking about it, can't stop working on it, can't stop reading about it, can't stop doing it. It's really easy to tune it out because you found your thing. And people just whispering in your ear, yeah, change your environment, get around people who encourage you. But in the midterm of that, you just find the people who actually know if you're happy, and they're a pretty good pulse check if you're on the right or wrong path.
It's an interesting point too, and sometimes I think it's harder in that later situation, right? So when you're first starting out, you're excited about whatever you're doing, and you have a lot of people telling you like, oh, that's stupid, that's not going to work, whatever it is. And sometimes those voices are almost easier to kind of like honestly just being almost like a fuck you attitude, right? Of like,
yep,
yeah, I'm going to do it. However, or farther along, when now you have these external voices telling you that you're doing really well, you have the trendy office, you've raised millions of dollars, you're successful, you're gaining revenue, whatever it might be, it's almost harder to block that out and be like, well, actually, I shouldn't be doing this, and I don't want to be doing this. And almost having to take that big step back, right? Or that perceived step back of, the outside world being like, well, why would you walk away from that? Or why would you leave that? Or why would you change that? It was, you had all this stuff, but realizing that it didn't matter. And I think that's almost tougher. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, definitely. I think once people have some degree of success, I think why it's really hard to get good content information, what led to that success, is it's really easy for that individual to forget what got them that success in the first place. So a book that I love and reread when I can is Ego is the Enemy, and it all kind of encircles around people who had some success in a very difficult field area. That could be a military general, that could be Steve Jobs or everybody in between, and really had to fight through people telling them they weren't going to succeed or pushing them down. And then at the moment of success, and I think this has happened to me in my own life, forgetting what got you there in the first place, and not treating that journey that you took, difficult as it was, as a necessary step, can lead you to either stay in things that you don't want to be in, or make huge blunders when you do the next thing. And I think for me as an individual, it was really, after succeeding at, the science things I was doing, and that, I was able to get these meetings and so on, and going off in all these different directions, where getting back to, well, what got me there in the first place? What was the work that I put in, and the interest that I had, and that drive that I had to really get me to that point, where maybe at the end I didn't like it as much as I did when I started, but that journey there is something that probably ends up needing to be replicated in some way, shape, or form the next time I do the next thing. And I think it's just really hard to look back at something, particularly things that you succeeded at, and really go back and say, what actually got me there? What truly brought me to that? If you fail at something, you'll have a pretty good idea what made you fail. But if you succeed at something, I think it's really, really hard to have the discipline around what actually got me in the first. This could be as an individual, as a company, as a organization, a country, just it kind of goes all the way up and down, where I see this in companies I work at, I see this in things that I start, where it's like we have this difficult journey. Can we stay grounded with the thing that got us here, so we make no assumptions about what's going to get us to the next thing and rest on our laurels of where we're at?
Yeah, no, totally. And, kind of related to that is I remember in our conversation, we talked about, as you were trying to figure out what to do next and tried a couple of different jobs, and this whole idea of work-life balance, right? Of how it isn't a cookie cutter shape. It isn't one shape, and that's what it is. And that's what it looks like for everybody. And, I shared with you my story about, I was working on one project and I was doing 80, 100-hour weeks, 6-7 days a week, every week for 6 months straight. And then I went into a new role where I was doing, 40 hours and maybe 20 hours of actual work a week. And I would go home absolutely exhausted after the 40 hours and way more tired than I was when I was doing 80 to 100. And
what a paradox, right? You're just like, wait a minute, this doesn't sound like what everyone's been telling me and all the advice podcasts I hear.
Exactly, right? And just not understanding it. And for me, a big turning point was, I remember I had a moment where I looked out and I went, oh, this is how people lose 5-10 years of their life, because I'd fallen into the routine, right? I was sitting there, like, honestly reading email newsletters for most of my day, just kind of going through it. And just being like, oh, I've done the exact same thing for 2 weeks now. And like, if I'm not careful, I can, just go to sleep and bam, 5 years is gone. And really realizing and it cementing in my mind that I need to do something that I'm passionate about, and I need a project that I actually enjoy. And that means I'm going to work on it a lot, but I enjoy doing that work. And just changing up that idea of what, quote unquote work-life balance is. Cause I think you had a similar, experience where you had a lot of freedom in a role, but weren't fulfilled. And actually, that work-life balance wasn't correct for you either.
Yeah. And that's why it's critical, again, doing what you're doing, because I think a lot of advice kind of is the lowest common denominator, what works for everybody. And I really think figuring out what makes you click and optimizing around that is really important. I've found that, throughout my career, I always had the on button. I'm going to work, I'm going to grind, I'm going to do this and this. And, that work-life balance kind of went off in the opposite direction, where I was working on things that I liked, but, I wasn't taking time for fitness and health and mental health and wellness, and charging and so on. And then a role that I had after that was a complete opposite. I barely worked more than 35 to 40 hours a week. I could exercise, I could travel, I could do everything. And it was so confusing to me to kind of come around to the idea of I'm paid well, I have good hours, I'm learning stuff, I can go travel, I can do anything I want, and yet I feel unfulfilled. I feel unfulfilled compared to when I'm staying up till 4 a.m. working on some iOS prototype thing that I'm doing with my friends. I don't get it. Everyone tells me, oh, take your vacation and then you'll feel fulfilled. And the advice I was getting just didn't seem to match with me as an individual. And I realized that one thing is, you're probably not going to change yourself by reading a book and you're probably not going to change your predispositions. You just kind of adapt to who am I as an individual and what expectations should I have around that. And for me, that really turned into, I need something incredibly intellectually stimulating and intrinsically rewarding. And it doesn't matter how much or how little I work. If I don't have that, I will kind of burn out, be depressed, kind of feel like my life doesn't have any meaning. And when I do have it, then I can I need to put boundaries and fit in kind of explorations that have no productive value. It's like, maybe I should learn to ski or to hike or do something like that, make time for that. But I realized kind of what is my anchor point and what can I kind of sub in versus the other way around. And it's different for different people. And, if people are listening to this, like, what, that doesn't really sound like it works for me, then good. It's good that you know that. But for other people where they've heard a lot of advice about balance and, I need to, you need to constrain your life in this way, and then don't look at emails. If you want to look at emails of the weekend and it actually makes you excited, then do it. Just understand that could be counter to your ultimate goal of doing something, rewarding, because you're not giving yourself space to think.
Yeah.
or you're not giving yourself space to recharge or explore other opportunities. So that was definitely a huge realization for me, is I could have the perfect work-life balance and be the worst mood, kind of anxiety, depression that I've had in my life. I could have the exact opposite where I'm working like crazy and be the happiest that I've been. And that's just happened high school, college, after college. When I'm firing in all cylinders, yeah, maybe I'm not traveling and sleeping and all these other things that I probably should be doing as much as I want to, but man, do I feel good.
Yeah, for sure. And, it was interesting you said earlier about finding, creative outlets that actually, that you actually resonate with, and
Mm-hmm.
realizing that those are different for everybody too. And, like reimagining what creativity is. And, like for you, working on an iOS app might be a creative outlet, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
actually how you recharge or what gets you excited. And other people look at that and go, well, you're crazy, right? Like my
They'll say
creative.
that's work. They'll say that's
Yeah,
work.
exactly.
That can't possibly be how you want to spend your free time. And I'm like, well, what if it is? What if this is fun?
Yeah. And I think it's removing that and, not pushing what you view something as for other people is really what it
Mm-hmm.
ultimately comes down to. We are different people. Everybody is different. And so you can take bits of advice from everybody, but it's not going to be an all or nothing, like blanket statement. This works for everybody, or this has worked for me, so it's automatically going to work for you.
Yep. Yep. And that's probably it's a really tough one because I don't have a great answer on how to arrive on this, but really understanding what is something that can be shaped or malleable in your persona or kind of change over time versus your core kind of, no matter what you do, you need this, this is how you tick. And it's really hard over time to debug what that actually is. When you're in high school and you're around a lot of the same people, no one really kind of jumps out to be their own individual personas. And it's funny because, nobody was talking about personality tests until after we got out of college, because suddenly, we're now off on our own, actually choosing the people we want to be around, choosing the careers and interests. And all of a sudden there's a big explosion. Oh, I'm a ENF, whatever, and an INTJ. Like,
Yeah.
well, why are people doing this? It's because finally they've been given permission to figure out what makes them tick and what actually, what their true interests are. And it's not as if, many friends of mine who have found the things that they really love didn't really love those things before. It's just they weren't really given opportunity and license to go try that, figure out what that was for themselves.
Yeah. And I think even like the niching down, right, of making things a little bit more mainstream, of just, as things enter the culture, even of like video games used to be, very nerdy, very like waste of time, 100%, like don't do it, like it's going to rot your brain. And now like
Mm-hmm.
it's huge in culture, right? And it's actually a lot of
Yep.
times considered cool. And like there's, so much that's gone around it. But as we're running out of time here, but I did want to touch on one thing for sure, which is,
Yep.
we've talked a lot about the environment that you put yourself in and the people that you surround yourself with, how important
Mm-hmm.
it is, and sometimes even like how freeing it can be. And, I think back to, I imagine what it must have felt like for you when you first went to that, national science competition and met these, kids that were similar to you, that, like, almost that feeling of belonging, right? But also the feeling of, them pushing you and seeing
Mm-hmm.
that, what's possible. And, for me, I'm very competitive. And so I like people that, will push me, because it makes, it raises me up. Um, why do you think that the people that you surround yourself with and the environments that you put yourself in, like, why are those so important? And in your life, how have you found those environments and those people?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great question, and probably, at least I've found to be the most important thing by far, in terms of shaping my career, my life. I think the base advice people get sounds so obvious and almost idiotically so. You're the average of the five people that you spend the most time with. Okay, yeah, whatever. But it's one of those things that is actually genuinely, truly, like, just come back to that again and again and again. Are you happy or unhappy? Look who you're around. Look what you're around. And for me, I think in as the further you go down in your life, the greater degree of control you have over that. So, I in high school, I had my regular high school, and I had this math science program, which kind of put me in an environment where certain interests of mine were rewarded and encouraged. And then I get to this science fair and I suddenly see, oh my God, this is where all these people are. But something I didn't think about enough was how, a college isn't a college isn't a college. And I honestly, when I went to my college, thought, oh my God, there's a med school and a lawyer. And I went and talked to all these professors, like, hell yeah, let's work in these projects together. And then the structure of the school was very discouraging of any kind of creativity or not following this kind of standard track, and it was very stifling. I found, and I went from being this naive person who wanted to get in every room to building up in my mind, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that, or maybe I don't belong in this room, or maybe I shouldn't. A lot of that I kind of had to unlearn after the fact. But even within those environments, I think it's so important to, I would go to parties and I'm just talking to people about what they do and their aspirations. They want to build something. Someone's like, I'm in fraternity rush. This guy's like, hey, I didn't get a little letter and card back from them. They're like, I still want to talk to you. Just write down your email. Let's go meet. And I'm working on this biomechanical whatever thing, because like I think we should talk about this. And I think in the environment where you don't truly feel like the environment is rewarding kind of what you're interested in, the people are probably still there. They're also probably kind of being a bit of a chameleon. And I think this kind of Hacker House was this great outlet for that finally at the end of my college career. And then you can take that a step further and move to places like the Bay Area. And everyone's talking about, oh, remote world forever. But like, I really do think the culture of a place can shape what you think is possible and what you actually kind of portray yourself as an individual and what opportunities you think you can pursue. Where the thing for me about the Bay Area had nothing to do with, it's not like there's anything special about the physical built location. I mean, there's great nature and all those things. It was just people who encouraged and were curious and would evaluate you as an individual on the basis of your intellectual interest and your curiosity, rather than what your parents did or how much money you had or what clothes you wore. And if you kind of take those things away, then you can just focus on that creative aspect. And I've just found time and time again that if you don't find yourself getting very far with this thing that you just cannot stop thinking about or cannot kind of withhold your passion for, but you're just incredibly discouraged of what you're around, change your environment, because it's probably them and it's probably not you. And that could be the college that you're in, that could be the state or city that you're in, the county that you're in, or whatever. Change your environment, go find where that's rewarded and encouraged, because your life is too short to just kind of push against the grain and convince people to be interested in something that they're not. Because to your point, these niches going mainstream, a lot of times they end up, that thing that you're interested in, 3, 5, 10 years later, everyone cares and everyone's interested. And you're just like, wow, well, I knew that. I knew it. I knew this was coming. And this has happened so many times. Harrison, who you had on the show, he was just shouting in the wind about his ideas about dating and live entertainment, getting people off their phones and so on. And he just dropping him into New York, instant, 180. That was the right environment that encouraged people to get on stage and make a fool of themselves and entertain and tell stories. And that just wasn't being rewarded where we were in San Francisco. Whereas the opposite, for me, combining science and technology into a career, there are very few places on earth that you can do that, much less places where people encourage you to pursue that as a dream. And I think it can totally change your life. And it is one of those things where, yes, like look at the people you're around, kind of have those people who are your supporters, but you don't need to struggle against the environment that you're in, because it might be them and it might be rather than you. So if you do feel that strong feeling about this thing, find the place that actually encourages and rewards that, because it will change your life completely.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And as you're talking there, I was thinking about sometimes you really just need to change up the other people, right? Or your environment. And like, instead, because I think of what a lot of people do is that they try to shift the people around them towards the thing that they want, right? Of like, oh, I now have this new interest in whatever it might be, and trying to get those people around them to like go with them. And sometimes it's just like, no, like I need to go find completely new people that have been in whatever that is for a while, and just like be around them and like meet them. And, you resonate with some, you won't with others. Or like just a complete environment shift of just like, yeah, move to a new city, move to a new environment. And it forces you to do that. Yeah, no, it's a really interesting idea of, almost forcing that change. And, when we were talking a little bit about, kind of how COVID has, changed things for us, is making a lot of relationships a lot more intentional now, where you need to put in the effort. You're not just, necessarily showing up or, keeping up appearances, whatever it might be. It's like, who do I actually want to be around now? And for me, it's a lot more intention around the environments that I'm in, the people that I'm around. And instead of just feeling like I should have or need to
Mhm.
be there.
Yeah, yeah. That's been a huge silver lining. And I say this with, the great asterisks of this is a horrific situation, but one of the silver linings of it is you literally have to make a public health choice as to whether or not you're going to see somebody and
Yeah.
whether or not you're going to take that risk. And fortunately, with vaccines rolling out as they are, I think something that people should really think about is how can you reemerge on your own terms. And you've had perhaps an experience where you can pick and be much more picky and choosy about who you see, who you spend time with, who you keep up with, and it might be sooner than you think. Vaccine rollouts are going really well, where all of a sudden you feel all these obligations to see and hang out with and be around people and situations and jobs and so on that maybe you don't like or you don't actually want. So, you know, just think about that as we all get vaccinated, we're all excited to get back to the way things were. And maybe you should, I as an individual thinking about this, but anyone listening to this, how do you reemerge on your own terms and take this opportunity to push that reset button on people, on your career, on your own life, and not just kind of sleepwalk back into the way that things were, because maybe they weren't what you actually wanted them to be before all this went down.
I love that. Yeah. Like, how can you keep the lessons when the environment changes or when the rules change
Mhm.
back? Right. And so, awesome. We are wrapping up here. But I'm just curious, like, is there anything that we didn't get to talk about? Anything that you wanted to say, anything like that before I let you go here?
Yeah, I'd say, generally speaking, I love, what you're doing here because I think people really need to understand and see the journeys people have actually gone on. And again, we could talk for hours about, trying things, then failing and thinking I'm a failure and starting over again, this up and down and up and down and up and down. But I think just generally speaking, really understanding other people's journeys and taking stock of how that actually kind of does or does not actually line up with your own life can be really liberating to, you look at people and what they've done in their lives and see how they got there and actually really how they got there and look at your own life and don't compare it, but say, they ran into that struggle too. They had that challenge too. How do they get around that? How do they really overcome that? And how can I apply that to my own life instead of just seeing everyone's highlight reel and feeling bad about yourself? Because I've fallen into that trap. And honestly, the only thing that makes you not compare yourself to others is when you really truly feel like you're in your element and firing in all cylinders. I won't kind of sugarcoat that, but the thing that's helped me is being around people who can challenge my assumptions, looking at people's true journeys and figuring out how they actually got there, and realizing, sometimes some people take the elevator and some people take the stairs, right? And everyone's got their own way of doing it. And I appreciate you putting content like this together and having people on your show because I think people need to hear this and not just unhealthily compare themselves, just figure out their own way and how they're going to do things in their own life.
I love that. Thanks for saying that. And I think it was one of the most powerful moments in my life where, these things that I've struggled with or have failed at or whatever it might be, hearing other people did too,
Yeah.
right? And just hearing that you're not alone. And like, oh, okay, other people have gone through this too. Other people have made it out. So I'm glad that resonates, and thank you for saying that. If people want to get in touch with you, like, where would be the best place? Like, would it be social media, or do you have a website or anything like that if anyone's curious about anything that we talked
Yeah,
about?
yeah. So you can follow me on Twitter. So look up my name, Ashoka Rajendra. It's my first name, Ashoka, and then R-A-J. So find me on Twitter. And then I also have a Substack where I write about, at least recently, more about kind of how science has taken on the pandemic and some of my day job. But yeah, feel free to find me on Twitter. Look at my Substack. Very few people read it, so, but I'm trying to write more and put some of these lessons out there for hopefully somebody else can benefit.
Awesome. And so the last question I ask everybody is, what does this next phase of your journey look like? taking it however you want, personally, professionally, wherever you want to go with it.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's just riffing on the what we just talked about is how do I reemerge from COVID on my own terms? I think I've found the subject matter and domain and thing that I could spend the next 10 years of my career on. How do I really keep pulling on that thread? Where does that go? And then in my personal life, how do I just focus on the people and things that bring me true happiness? I think before, you know, an extroverted person, but I filled my life with a lot of people that just to not be alone. And how can I just really fill it with people who truly, you know, value me and you know, make me feel good about myself and are truly rewarding people to be around instead of just optimizing for not being alone. And that's really what the next phase of this is, really doubling down on the intellectual interest that I've discovered over, I would say, a decade of failure has led to this. And I mean that in the most positive light possible. But on a personal level, taking that same mindset of focusing on the people and experiences that are truly important instead of filling time and filling a room, because I think that can really mask other problems that I might have, and instead, and ultimately just not satisfy me. It's like drinking diet soda, right? You just have this weird taste that didn't really satisfy you.
Yeah.
And you know, I want the good stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks so much for being on. Really enjoyed myself. We'll chat soon. Okay.
Alrighty.